Oh, hello. Meet Optima Health, your friend for Medicaid coverage. Like any true friend, we can help make life a little easier with discounts on healthy food and gift cards for pregnancy and child checkups. We include vision and medical help 24/7. See more benefits at OptimaMedicaid.com/hello. It's time to say hello to Optima Health, a health plan you can count on.
Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat. Why so serious?
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the InSession Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for May 26, 2023. And I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy, plotting to blow up this podcast.
Plotting to blow up the podcast. I don't know if I know how to do that, Brendan. I certainly don't know how to blow up a pipeline. But one thing I do know how to do is blow up a hockey team. Because, my God, the Florida Panthers.
Okay. InSession Sports rides again.
Look, I know Ryan and Jay are going to be mad at me for doing this. And maybe this is not the most appropriate time to bring this up. However, the day we are recording this, we are just off the heels of the Florida Panthers, whose home is like 15 minutes that way from my house, from where I'm currently sitting.
I like how you actually pointed to it. What is that? Due west? Video, yeah. Is that due west for you or something like that?
That is more east, actually. It's kind of northeast-ish for me.
Okay. I was trying to avoid the Atlantic Ocean. That's why I was doing that.
Yeah, no, it's certainly, it's actually kind of interesting because when you drive on the highway to get to the stadium, and I this is going to sound like hyperbole, and I promise you it is not. So you're on this highway. On the left side is nothing but swamps. If you were to just do a hard left turn, you are turning into the swamp. Good luck with all the gators.
Well, I was going to say, it sounds like Gator City there. Welcome to Florida, indeed.
Yeah, it's nuts. And then on the right side...
Sounds like Australia when you describe it that way.
Well, and it's funny because on the right side of the highway is suburbia. So it's this interesting dichotomy where on the right side, it is, the Fort Lauderdale Sunrise area. It is traditional suburbia, but on the other side of the highway, nothing but swampland for miles and miles as far as the eye can see.
Don't you love when a town like that can have such like wild contradictions like that? I think I experienced that when I was living in Wisconsin for a while. I lived in Milwaukee, but of course I would have to go to a Packers game at least once. Yeah. And if I'm not mistaken, Green Bay is it's the smallest town to host a professional sports team in the entire country, or even in the entire world, if I'm not mistaken. Sure. So it's interesting that you've got Lambeau Field, and then across the street are a bunch of duplexes. It's not even in the middle of a city. It's just it's literally a small town, but it's got that same kind of dichotomous vibe that you're talking about. Yeah.
No, I've certainly heard that about Green Bay, Wisconsin as well, and Sunrise certainly has that as well, which makes it kind of interesting. But it's Florida is a hotbed for hockey. The sport played on ice. Yeah. The last 4 Stanley Cups, the finals anyway, have featured a team from Florida. The last 4. Unbelievable. And one of the teams that Florida will be facing in the finals will be one of Dallas or Vegas. So, I mean,
it's like, who would have known that a sport on ice would be most popular in the desert areas?
I'm telling you, if you are below the Mason-Dixon line, it's a hotbed for hockey right now. It's pretty wild. So
that's incredible.
Yeah, and this place is buzzing. Obviously the Miami Heat are doing very well simultaneously, but Miami, Fort Lauderdale, this whole area right now is on fire, and it's a lot of fun. Anyway, we're not here to really talk about
even
that.
the Gators are cheering them on at this point.
Yeah, Anyway, let's talk about how to blow up a pipeline. I don't know how to do it, but we did see a film that did thoroughly go over this.
I don't know. I feel like I haven't learned how to actually blow up a pipeline, but I will say the movie made me believe the characters in this movie knew how to do it.
There you go. Well, we're going to talk about it. It's a 2022 American environmentalist action thriller. This comes from director Daniel Goldhaber. It stars Ariella Barrer, Christine Forsyth, Lucas Gage, Forrest Goodluck, Sasha Lane, Jamie Lawson, among others that we'll get into as this conversation goes. I guess as we start here, Brendan, what were your expectations for this film? This isn't one that I think was on our radar when we did our most anticipated films of the year back in January. I do believe this premiered at Sundance, though, ironically, maybe a week or so after we did that episode.
Yeah.
What were your expectations going into this, and what did you think of the film?
Well, I as far as expectations, when a movie like this comes around, that's either very, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? It's an eco film of sorts. It's a very, it's a very activist-driven film, right? Mm-hmm. And movies like this, I feel like, can really fall apart at the seams pretty quickly if they go a certain route.
Sure.
And I guess what I was most afraid of was that the movie wouldn't come off as a propaganda piece. That's just honestly a little less interesting for me. I would have preferred to see something that was really just an efficient thriller on its own terms, but was more willing to strike a conversation on the differences between activism and terrorism, which is something that this movie does directly address. Mm-hmm. There are at least a few scenes between many of these characters where they have different outlooks. Their motives are more or less the same, but as far as their end goals, there are some minor disagreements between them, which is why I did think the film overall is fairly refreshing in what it's trying to do. I do think as far as how it's trying to blur that line between activism and just full violence for the sake of it, there is a bit of a debate to be had here. And I do think the movie is more willing to allow us as audiences to partake in a conversation and maybe not even agree with what we're seeing on screen. I've seen a few critics have different interpretations of the film, maybe seeing it as kind of a positive outlook on the impact that this kind of activism can actually have to provoke change. Yeah. And then I've seen other sides of that spectrum that say what we're seeing is actually kind of a dangerous thing. And maybe there isn't a right or wrong answer here. And maybe the film does take a slight easy route towards the end, but I do think enough of those complications are there to make this a rather nuanced experience. And I think as a film, it is a pretty thrilling one. It's certainly wearing some of the modern Safdie brothers isms on its sleeve a little bit, especially with the musical score. It was maybe a little distracting at times, but I did like these characters, and I think the way the film interweaves their backstories into this narrative is rather well done. It's hard to get flashback sequences like that just right without them seeming too repetitive or just telling the same thing over and over again, right? But I think these ones kind of do, but they add new complications to the story. So I do think it's a fairly effective film. I don't know if it's going to be one of my favorite films of the year, but I think as a thriller and as one that's more willing to incite conversation, I do think it's a pretty decent one.
Yeah, this is a really interesting film for a couple of reasons. One, because as we noted, this premieres at Sundance, and whenever a film comes out of the festival with a lot of hype and praise behind it, we have to take it with a little bit of grain of salt.
Sundance is a weird one. Yeah.
There is credence to the idea that festivals can probably, sometimes they can be put on a pedestal because of the experience. And look, oftentimes it's warranted. We've seen a lot of films come from not just Sundance, but name whatever festival you want, and everything that is said about those films are true.
I do feel like Sundance is maybe the most guilty of that, and that's not really a knock on Sundance directly, maybe just more on the hype that these films tend to receive and maybe what films ultimately get chosen to premiere at Sundance specifically. But I feel like that conversation happens a lot more with Sundance than other ones, which it's an interesting thought. I'm not saying that it's right or wrong, it's an interesting observation.
And perhaps that's because Sundance is the first festival of the year.
I was just
at the end
thinking
of January. We're starting to get into the bearings of the new year, so your excitement levels are probably high. And it's also interesting because a lot of the films that premiere at Sundance are typically these indie darlings, right? Some of them tend to be awards players. But when we're kind of
was Coda? Coda was a Sundance film, I think?
Yeah, Coda was, and that ended up being more of an audience hit than a lot of these films tend to do.
Sure.
But this is one of those movies that I find really fascinating because it has the hype behind it, which, going into the year, I didn't really know too much about this film. But coming out of Sundance, it's a notable film. It's one that you put on your list. And then you go to watch it, and it very distinctly taps into Ocean's 11 cinematically, given its precise storytelling and editing and urgency. This very much plays out like a heist movie. It is
it absolutely is a heist movie. Yeah, for sure.
But simultaneously, it's documentary-like in its commentary and messaging. If you were to tell me that this was the reenactment footage for a documentary about the oil crisis in America, I would almost believe you. And I say that as a good thing. I say that as a good thing. I love how intimate and personal and grounded this film is, but how dramatically engaging it is as a heist at the same time. And Ocean's 11, you have a fascinating variety of characters here, right? Beginning with Sochil, the passionate leader of this group. She doesn't feel as if passive protests are enough. We have to do something actively in order to make a difference. There's Theo, who is literally dying as a result of the oil industry. Her girlfriend, Alicia, is hesitant, but not going to let Theo do this without her. We have Michael, a Native American, who's justifiably indignant with oil companies. Similarly, he wants to take some sort of action, and he's very knowledgeable with bombs, which makes him valuable to a film like this, especially given its title. But he's also angry and volatile, so you never know how he's going to react. There's Dwayne, a Texas native who was upset with the oil industries who are building a pipeline in his backyard, very literally, and is seeing the ramifications up close. Then you have Rowan and Logan, a couple from Oregon, I believe it is.
Portland. Yeah. They were established from Portland, Oregon.
And they come off very untrustworthy initially, but in the end, they become two of the biggest heroes here, and I'm sure we can get into that as this conversation goes. So you have a complex group of characters who have almost nothing in common aside from wanting to disrupt an industry that's been causing extreme harm. And again, the messaging of this film isn't ambiguous. It heavily invokes those documentaries we get every year that are not shy about their commentary, but it's executed with a Steven Soderbergh indie spirit that he would no doubt be very proud of. I felt Soderbergh and the spirit of him all over this movie. It has, again, the Ocean's heist dramatic urgency, but also it carries heavily, something like a Kimmy, like those Soderbergh
I was
indie
just going to
movies.
say, as you're talking, I didn't really ever think of Soderbergh while watching it. Now, you're right that the narrative and just the overall framing of the film is definitely reminiscent of a heist movie like Ocean's 11, especially given how methodical and how elaborate and just how quickly edited it is, as you're talking about. But You're right, though, when you look at the later era of Soderbergh and his more experimental side, there is kind of a guerrilla-style tactic to this movie that isn't too different from, let's say, a movie like Unsane or Kimmy, like you're saying. Yeah, that is
this
definitely
film
here.
gets to have its cake and eat it, too. Like, it really gets the best of both worlds of Soderbergh, and that's all I could think about. And I think, and I say, again, I say that as a great thing. I think it channels the brilliance of Soderbergh in terms of, again, the heist elements and, the commercial filmmaking of Soderbergh, but that guerrilla indie ambiance and structure that he's so known for as well. This has that in spades as well. And again, I just think this is something that he would really like. And it's something I really liked. I don't know where this ranks for me in terms of 2023 films, but it's probably up there as one of my favorite films I've seen so far this year.
Yeah, the film does make some pretty interesting style choices, courtesy of director Daniel Goldhaber. Am I pronouncing that name right? Daniel Goldhaber?
I believe so. Yeah.
Goldhaber. Okay, I'm adding an F there that didn't exist, so that's my apologies.
Goldhaber. Yeah.
Goldhaber. Yes. But yeah, he does make a few interesting style choices that admittedly were a little distracting at first, especially given the use of text to transition between different chapters and different flashbacks, and the use of text itself is very I'm not sure what the font is, but it's very reminiscent of like 1980s sci-fi movies. I was very much thinking of like The Terminator, or like a David Cronenberg film like The Fly, for instance. And even the musical score here, coupled with that, kind of gives it that energy. And maybe that's where some of the Safdie brothers influence is that I'm also feeling. And I've seen a few other critics call out that influence as well, that there is kind of a Safdie energy to it.
Yeah.
And yeah, it might be a little distracting at times, but I can't deny that by the time the film reaches its third act, or at least near its third act, I was kind of wrapped up in it. But I think a lot of that is really due to these characters and their respective plights, their respective motivations. And as we see each of their motivations play out and what each of their stories are, I found my allegiance kind of getting torn a lot, which I thought was pretty interesting, because there are many cases where I can understand why these characters are acting out in the way that they do. And then when I think about it further, when I hear someone else's story, I think, are they a little unstable to be doing something like this? Emotionally unstable? And then it gets kind of complicated. And I do think that this movie is aware, or at least its goal is not to be a straight up propaganda piece. I think that would have been way too easy. I think that would have been a little bit too on the nose. And you're right. It is certainly clear as to who the quote unquote bad guys are. Really, any nuances here are how do we go about making an effort to change those things. And I do think the film does have a few different ideas on its mind, which I did respect. I at least respected that about it.
I do agree that there are some interesting nuances at play here, and I do think that the film is doing its best to examine those nuances with these characters and the choices they make. There might not be a lot of dialogue or verbal sparring that gets into those thematic ideas, but given what these characters choose, it certainly is there in parts. However, I will say this, even if people want to interpret this as straight up propaganda, and as I noted, in many ways, this does feel documentary-like, as if what we're seeing here is something that you could take this footage, embed it into a documentary about the oil crisis in America, just use this as reenactment footage, and it would be believable.
Sure.
And I kind of admire that robust ambition.
Sure. Yeah.
However,
you're not. Sorry, go ahead.
I will say, the reason I bring that up is because even if we want to interpret this as propaganda, its ideas, its morals, its ethics are not ambiguous. The film lays that out very clearly. However, it's, what I love about this film being what it is dramatically is that it's way more compelling than telling this story through one of those very lucid but maybe banal documentaries. Yeah. So you're taking a topic that you feel very strongly about, and instead of it being this, this flaccid exercise that gets thrown onto Netflix and maybe it goes viral. Maybe people talk about it. Who knows? You do something much more dramatically captivating. You channel Soderbergh or you channel whatever influences that, that this film wants to have. And you structure it in a way where, we can be engaged with these characters, where we can empathize with what they're feeling. We can empathize with the workload that goes into that. I think one of the best things about this film is how pragmatic and demonstrative it is.
It's a very procedural film. I love that about it.
Absolutely. There's not a ton of dialogue in this film, and they certainly don't talk about the things that they have to do.
They don't even really like each other that much. Some of them.
Well, and I noted that in my opening thoughts, this is a group of characters that don't really have too much in common outside of this fundamental, ethos of wanting to disrupt the oil industry for a variety of reasons where they've been affected personally, or they've certainly seen it up close. That's really the only thing that is tethering these characters together. And so, they don't really talk a whole lot. There's not a lot of verbal sparring here. It is very demonstrative. We just simply see them do the work. We see them put powder into these huge barrels and roll them around. And there's a physical grittiness to that. Or we see Michael working, with the bombs and putting all that together and the problematic little things that can happen that would destroy everything if one little thing goes wrong. Right. And there is an element of this film where we do see something go wrong, and you have to see these characters react in a real time sense. So I do love that this film is willing to engage us in that practical way. To me, that more than makes up for what this could be in terms of feeling like a propaganda piece, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. It chooses to be a movie. It chooses to be cinematic, which I do love about that. And I guess I should be a bit clearer when I say the film doesn't feel like a propaganda piece. That's not to say if you watch this movie and choose to see it as a propaganda piece, that's not saying you're wrong. But I don't think the movie is trying to tell every single person to agree that it is a propaganda piece and we have to blow shit up to make change. I don't think it's that simple, is basically what I'm trying to say, that not everyone is going to come out with that same mentality from the movie. And I don't think the movie is trying to get everyone to think the exact same way. So because of that, I wouldn't call it a propaganda piece, because it is inviting potential disagreements. And a lot of that is because of how these characters interact with each other, or how they don't interact with each other, and the fact that they all come from different backgrounds and different experiences. The fact that you have a character like Dwayne here, played by Jake Weary, is a great choice to help counterbalance that too. Just the simplicity of his story and the fact that he is a local in all of this. So I think that helps give it a new perspective as well. So the movie does make a lot of choices narratively and emotionally to really differ itself from other movies like this, especially documentaries like you're talking about, some of those more banal documentaries. This is not an inconvenient truth. This is not something like that, which of course a somewhat, a related topic in its own, part of the business side of things, but it that has its own agenda on its mind. This is more willing to be a little bit more bold in its storytelling.
I agree. This is anything but those very simple agenda-driven docs that, again, you'll find on Netflix, all the time. And while, it certainly has its convictions similarly to those documentaries, but this film is making more bold choices. And at the very least, again, it's doing something cinematically to engage us in a very different way than those documentaries would. And it's also interesting to me because you're talking about how this film isn't necessarily invoking people to go out and regurgitate the events of this film.
Well,
but
yes and no. It's kind of some people might, and that's kind of the interesting thing about the film, right? Is that people are going to have different motivations, I guess, sparked because of this movie.
Well, I wanted to bring that up to circle to the end of the film, because I think what's interesting about the ending of this film is that it's actually very ambiguous. I think the film makes some really great choices in terms of the ramifications of the actions of this group, in the sense that, I guess I don't want to give too much away, but I don't know what spoilers there is given the title of this film. I will say this: what happens to the oil industry as a result of the actions of this group? We never find that out. Is it truly disruptive in the way that they think it is? We don't know. Maybe not. Maybe they did all of that and nothing changed.
And nothing happened. And maybe it just incites a more, I guess, rebellious form of violence that accomplishes nothing.
Yeah.
And that's, well, and this is where I'm glad we're having this conversation, because in the moment when I saw the film, I felt like the ending was maybe taking the easy way out and actually picking a side there. But as we talk about it more, I think you might be right. I do think the film concludes in a way that maybe a lot of these actions were in vain, and they're not going to lead to the desired conclusions that these characters wanted, or even the necessary actions that are required to make change if they're just going to incite more antagonism between people. And it's hard to tell if this actually was a successful venture or not. So I think you're onto something there.
Yeah, I mean, and I also think of the choices made at the end of this film with Sochil and Theo in terms of responsibility, I'll say vaguely. And again, like, circling back to what you mentioned earlier in terms of this dichotomy of activism versus terrorism, it's very clear that while they are certainly threading that needle as closely and as, you know, as precisely as they can, however, what they choose at the end of this film is, at least from their perspective, perhaps, again, as you're talking about, we can certainly interpret it in different ways. There's a conversation to be had. But from their perspective, this has nothing to do with terrorism and wanting to hurt people. The group creates this plan that is very purposefully, it is meant to hurt the oil industry. They make sure that no one is hurt in terms of civilian casualties anyway.
Yep.
And at the end of it all, there is responsibility that is to be had from those two characters. And then you think about even like what we see with Dwayne at the end, or I'm trying to think of the character there that is it? It's not Michael. Dwayne, maybe? No, Dwayne is, or Sean.
Dwayne was Jake Weary. Sean, played by Marcus
when he's
Friedner.
On this college campus, he sees, you know, this cop car in the distance, and, you know, he's a little uncertain. Like, this film ends in an ambiguous way where we don't really know what the future it holds for these characters. It might not be the bright future that they think they are invoking by taking these actions. It could be way more gray than that, or it might be more bleak than that. The film doesn't really answer those questions. And I think that is done. That's a very purposeful choice to, I think, circle back to that idea that you mentioned earlier of, you know, people taking these actions. It might not end the way that you think they will. It might. Who knows? Because we don't know. But because we don't know, I think that in and of itself, I think, would stifle that idea of this being propaganda or encouraging people to do this. Like, that ambiguity is that stop sign.
I agree with that. I think that's a really great point, which is why, as we're talking here, I was a little unsure about the ending, but now I'm certainly coming around to it because of what you're talking about there and what the film does seem to be evoking. It doesn't even seem to suggest that the actions carried out by these characters are going to provoke other people to be inspired in the right or even wrong ways. This could lead to even more problems. Who knows? Like, I'm not saying it will, but we don't really know.
We don't know.
In many ways, the way that the film ends, you can almost suggest they, morally, ethically kind of end where they begin in some ways, at least where the state of the world, I mean, maybe not the physical state of the world, because maybe this did lead to some physical ramifications with regard to the oil industry. But again, to your point, we don't really know. This could have been a minor speed bump in the overarching oil industry. This is a huge industry we're talking about that owns so much other than just this one pipeline in Texas. So, who knows if this would have really activated as much change as they needed. And you're right, this could have been all in vain.
I mean, is it worth doing this for whatever gain you have? And it might not be anything at all. Is it worth going through this that for the rest of your life you're always having to look over your shoulder? That's a great point. Or thinking of it this way, you might inspire other people to carry out some of the same things that you're doing, but what if some other people take advantage of that freedom and do it wrongly and actually choose to hurt people? It really. This movie's actually more interesting than I'm giving it credit for now. I'm liking it more as this conversation's going, because I do think it is trying to provoke this type of conversation. I agree. And on the flip side of that coin, maybe the answer for these characters is yes, because at times we do see their conviction. They are in this group for a reason. They have these convictions for a reason. And I do think the film does a great job of giving us the backstories of these characters to help us understand their motivations without interrupting and disrupting the pacing and rhythm of this film. And by giving us the little bit that we need to know about these characters, it does give credence to the idea that maybe the answer to those questions for them is unequivocally yes. Whatever little we can do to sabotage the oil industry that is doing so much harm, even if it's just a pinprick, it's worth it. And that gives them some sort of internal satisfaction that they can justify to themselves.
Yeah.
I think you can really flip that coin either way, but that ambiguity I think goes a long way here and certainly sparking a conversation here and also deterring, like again, that idea of encouragement. I don't think that this film is doing that because of the ambiguity that we get.
I agree. And from what I understand, that might differ a little bit from the book that this film is based on.
Which I haven't read.
I haven't read it either. It's the title of the book is also called How to Blow Up a Pipeline. It's by Andreas Malm, and apparently it is a work of nonfiction that was trying to use a history of social justice movements to argue that property destruction should be considered a valid tactic in the pursuit of environmental justice. And I'm reading this off of the trivia page for IMDb, and that is a potential idea that this movie could be provoking in people, could be inspiring in people, but it's not the only idea. And that's where I think the film is more complicated. Otherwise, it would just be a lecture, and that's what. I'm glad we didn't get a lecture out of it.
I
got
agree.
A movie.
I agree, and I think when you take a step back and you look at that more broadly, this is quintessentially what I love about art, because perhaps more than anything else, and again, for all the reasons we just talked about in the last 10 to 15 minutes, I don't think this film is trying to encourage people to do this.
Yeah.
But if anything, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the oil crisis, this idea, it certainly weaves itself into many, many different issues that our society has to deal with on a daily basis. But what's so great about art is that it can work as a coping mechanism. Perhaps more than anything else, this is a story that, as an artist or even as someone that just partakes in art, that views art, you can have this experience and feel that same conviction, and this becomes your punching bag of sorts.
Yeah,
this becomes a way for you to cope. That idea of we're not going to go out and actually destroy property or actually hurt other people. like there's certainly obviously a vivid distinction between fantasy and reality. And perhaps this is simply a coping mechanism. We write something that I would love to do. I would love to do this. Mm-hmm. I also don't have the courage to do it.
But that might make it a bit selfish. But again, sometimes we have to act selfishly in order to make that, make those emotional changes that we need to.
Absolutely. And there's certainly a lot of art, and sometimes it's not quite as extreme as this, but art works as that coping mechanism for us to feel what others are feeling, to help us grapple with the indignities that many of us experience. And I can certainly, like, I don't have any sort of close ties to that particular industry, and I've never seen the ramifications up close, but I can imagine others that have seen those ramifications, that have felt those ramifications, that they don't have necessarily the conviction to go out and do something, but they watch this film and they feel what these characters are feeling, and it makes them feel better. And that is, to me, the beauty of art. And maybe that's what this film is more than anything else, is it's a comfort blanket that allows them to tap into those feelings, and they're expressed through this film, and it becomes a cathartic thing for them.
It's a way for us to listen to that perspective. We always talk about that, open-mindedness, listen to perspective, because it might not be your own and you might learn something. You might never agree with that perspective, but at least you learn a new perspective and a different way of life that other people are dealing with that you may never even thought of. And I think doing it in this way, it allows us to sort of think of it from what it would be like in their shoes. So I guess the moral of this whole thing, JD, movies are good.
Movies are good.
Movies invite conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's interesting about that idea of perspective as it relates to our central group here, and this ties to what we were saying earlier in terms of the nucleus that holds them together, these characters would probably never hang out outside of this one circumstance.
Well, I mean, maybe not. I think some of them would, but I mean, they certainly come from... I mean, if this were a high school movie, this is definitely a Breakfast Club kind of
very much.
Kind of
it is very Breakfast Clubby. That is a great comparison.
They are all from different cliques.
Absolutely. Aside from like Xochitl and Theo are good friends. Like there's an interesting scene earlier in the film when they're at Xochitl's mother's funeral, and Theo has a simple line, simply letting us as the audience know just how close these two characters are, where she says, "Your mom was a mom to me too." And even though we don't know much about Theo's upbringing, this film doesn't have time to get into that, but that one little line gives us insight into the idea that she probably didn't grow up with a home, that Xochitl's mother was a mom to her, that these two individuals are close. They're really close friends as a result. And so, they've been together. And then when Alicia comes into the picture, that certainly adds to that trio as well. But aside from that, like, I mean, these are, these people have their little cliques, and they don't really, there's no cohesive gel that's keeping them together aside from their conviction of this one manner. And I just find it real interesting to see how the film kind of funnels the idea of perspective that you're talking about. How we might come from different parts of not just the country, regionally. They come from all over the United States. They come together to do this thing, but their perspectives of the world are so different. So very different, and yet they can find unity still. Yeah. And that idea, I think, is fascinating, because in the world of the digital age we live in, that is so lost. Like, that idea is almost foreign at this point. So, like, I just love how the film kind of toys with that as well.
Was there a performance that stood out to you the most of the crop here?
Well, I mean, Ariella Barrer gives the most emotionally forward performance here.
Yeah, she's kind of, if any one of them is the lead, it's most likely her,
for
I'd
sure.
say.
for sure. And she wears her emotions on her sleeves the most throughout this film. And she becomes the de facto leader of the group in some ways. I will say, I really love Forrest Goodluck as Michael. And I think a lot of it comes down to, again, early on, he's just so angry, indignant, and, is justifiably, like those emotions are justifiable for sure. And then it's interesting to see the little nuances of that performance as it goes, right? Because when they get to the house and he's working on the explosives, there's a diligence there. We see how smart and creative he is, the risk that he's willing to take. There's also a little bit of humor with him at the same time. Like when he's telling Sean,
it's kind of dry.
Yeah. A little dry. Like, hey, look, if something explodes, just, don't come unless I'm on fire. Or whatever he says to him there. But it's like this
That's
little
a good point. There is some levity in this movie that we haven't highlighted yet. It's kind of, you kind of have to look for it, but there are moments here for sure.
Absolutely. Or when it's time to go. They've done all the legwork. It's time to do the thing. And what does Michael say? Like awkwardly as they're standing in a circle goes, proud of you guys. They just like laugh at him.
They all just kind of look at each other.
It's like this awkward little moment.
Yeah, I think one of the funniest moments of the film for me doesn't even involve the character of Michael. It's when Xochitl and Sean go to visit Dwayne and his family, and they're going through the actual pipeline. And Dwayne's wife offers them beer. And I think Sean says, I'll take water. And she goes, oh, we have no water. It's kind of a devastating thought, but it's played in a way that it's like you kind of have to laugh at the unfortunate reality that it's not that you have to laugh. That sounds cruel to say it that way. That's not what I mean. But like there's something the way that it's played that it almost like it's like it's meant to come off a little tongue in cheek, I guess. But then you kind of think back at the actual ramifications that people like Dwayne's family are forced to contend with, and then all of a sudden you realize alcohol and beer might be their only source of water at this time. And that's kind of a scary thought. But the film is not without a few moments of levity here and there. And the ones involving Michael, to your point, are probably the ones that I appreciated the most. The ones that are most direct probably involve the character of Logan, played by Lucas Cage. And it's mostly just due to how verbally obtuse that he seems to be. Like there's one line of dialogue where Rowan, I think, says, I have to go take a pee, and he says something like pee on me or something like that. Apparently I just looked this up. I think Lucas Cage's dialogue was mostly like 75% improvised.
That makes sense.
Which kind of makes me appreciate it a little bit more. But I mean, that's definitely the most direct form of levity that the film has. But I was definitely more appreciative of the examples you're talking about involving characters like Michael, for instance. Yeah,
I mean, the first moment we see Logan in the film, he's like snorting cocaine off a tape. Like that's our first image of the character, right? And even his relationship with Rowan, they're very carefree, which is why throughout a lot of this film, they seem like a ticking time bomb, if you will. Pun intended.
Oh, yeah. Fair. Nice work.
That they are going to completely ruin this for everybody. And then without getting into spoilers, and this is a true spoiler, so I'll avoid it, but there comes a moment where they have to take action together. And there's something that happens unexpectedly where they have to react on the fly. And I did find that interesting to see how the film subverts that expectation of these two will inevitably make this go awry, especially given, the half hour before they are supposed to take this action, they indulge in an activity that is just like, it's just done. This is done. Everything is about to be ruined.
They're such children. They just
absolutely, they're children. You can't trust, and I do love that the film takes us all the way to that edge to be like, no, why would you give them this responsibility? And then the film subverts that. And I did find that compelling, especially given that there are physical ramifications at play there. Yeah. And then you interweave Rowan and her involvement With the police, I'll say vaguely what that means for all of this as well. There's some interesting complexity there with these characters that I do like. Again, in terms of the storytelling, how it interweaves its messaging, it's almost documentary-esque feel with its Soderbergh-isms. I actually find it really great, especially the more we talk about it here. I think it's
I'm liking it more.
Actually, quite incredible.
And one thing I noticed too, before we get to some final thoughts here, I alluded to this a little bit in the beginning of this conversation, but the character of Dwayne, played by Jake Weary, and I don't think Jake Weary is one of the I think he gives a good performance, but it's meant to be very passive and very
stoic.
Quiet. So it's so that stoicism doesn't really allow the character to rise above the other characters from a performative standpoint, but I don't know if I'm reading too much into it, but I like the choice to have a character like him part of this group, and because I feel like it's sort of playing with our narrow-minded assumptions of who would be.
Yes.
You know,
yes, 100%.
And not to be. I guess if I'm going to be direct about it, you know, people like us as viewers and critics might automatically assume this is the conservative that supports the oil business. You know, it not
plays
to say
with
that
stereotype. It does.
Yeah, and I don't know if that is his, you know, his political or social background. I mean, we don't really know. We're just assuming that. But the film is kind of challenging us to think about our assumptions with people, right? And if that is the case, if that is truly his, you know, his identity, then to include a character like that here further blurs that line even further. And I found that really interesting.
Absolutely. Circling back to what we were saying earlier with how cliquey these characters are, they have their own little pocket, their bubble that defines them, and it's so different from everybody else in the group. And he certainly has a very distinctive identity that initially we might interpret as, you know, the conventional Texan, but given what he's experienced and what he conveys to the audience and to these other characters, he certainly does refute that a little bit. And it is interesting to see how that, you know, gives him a pathway to that nucleus that we talked about earlier. I will say this as well, you know, because you were talking about how Jake Weary's performance, he's not given as much to do as some of the others. I will say this, one of my favorite moments of the film cinematically, and this is a combination of Weary's performance, but also Goldhaber's direction, because we get to the moment where the how to blow up a pipeline, it starts to crystallize. You're talking
about the scenes at the bar?
Yeah. So like there's a moment where we hear something in the distance. Well, actually, Goldhaber shows us this action visually, but there's a cut to Dwayne in the bar. We hear it in the distance, and then we get an edit to a close-up of him where his eyes just ever so slowly roll to the right. That I thought was incredible. Like that little nuance, I think, was honestly one of the best moments of the film.
Yeah, I agree. And if I have any maybe, I guess, selfish criticisms of the film, I would have liked to see a bit more of an extended sequence of Dwayne in that bar, especially when was that an FBI agent or maybe the sheriff that actually came in? It's certainly manufacturing some traditional tension for a thriller like this, but there's something about the way that it's played that I kind of would have liked to see an extended sequence of that. Because it was genuinely thrilling, and a lot of that is due to Goldhaber's direction and Jake Weary's performance in the moment too.
Yeah, the editing there is really great, and you know we were talking about the subtlety and the stoicism of Weary's performance, and I love the combination of that there, the edit and the facial reaction by Weary there, like. Everything that Dwayne is feeling in terms of trepidation and fear and excitement is all in that one look and all in that one gaze. Like it's really fantastic stuff. So
I agree.
All right, let's go ahead and wrap this up. Any concluding thoughts on how to blow up a pipeline?
As we're talking, we keep talking about the film's cinematics and just the way that it overall looks. So I do want to give some credit where credit is due to some of the people working behind the scenes here, and I'm trying to look this up, but my mouse is giving me some problems. The cinematography here by, man, I wish I was
even
getting
know
a
how
chance.
to say that name.
Talal de Castro, I guess that it is. I'm not really sure, but I thought the movie is definitely documentary-esque.
It's
in that
well
way.
shot.
I thought it's very well shot. The music by Gavin Breivik, again, definitely has some of those obvious influences, whether it be from the 1980s or maybe what we've seen in, like a Safdie Brothers-ish kind of movie now. Like it definitely reminded me of something like Good Time. Less so Uncut Gems, but more something like Good Time.
Yeah.
And there are other movies that are doing some similar things, so it may not be all that revolutionary in what it's doing as a thriller, but I think by the second act of the film, I was starting to get on its aesthetic wavelength.
Yeah, sure.
and then it starts to work. I think really it's the character work in these performances that carry it. And maybe I would have liked it a little bit more if there were a few moments of silence where the background was less driven by musical score and then really amped up when it needed to. But when it gets to that point, it doesn't really matter as much anymore.
Yeah.
I do think it is an effective film, and I like that it doesn't feel like a lecture, like we're saying.
Yeah.
And whether you want to watch this and look at it from a sociopolitical lens or not, I mean, you don't have to. You can just watch this and be entertained, and that's all you can get from it. And that's if that's all you want, you're going to get that. And I do think the film does function well enough on its own terms that if you're just looking for a thriller, that's what you'll get. And you don't have to dive further into it. But for those who do want to dive further and have a conversation, I'm glad that the film is asking us to do so.
Absolutely. And if the film is functioning as a lecture, and I do think that in some ways, if I was going to refute you a little bit there, Brendan, the idea that you can simply watch this as a work of entertainment, as a thriller, it is really hard to ignore the convictions of this film in terms of...
It is. It's just the superficial elements of how it feels like a film. It's all there. It's all there to keep you engaged.
For sure. And that's the point that I was wanting to regurgitate once again, that even if it's a lecture, and you will certainly feel and understand the convictions of this film, it's at least done in an incredibly entertaining way. It is very, very well done. It is captivating from beginning to end. And that really comes down to a lot of those cinematics that you're talking about. The performances, which we've talked about. You mentioned the cinematography and the music. I echo your thoughts there. I've mentioned the editing a couple of times, so shout out to Daniel Goldhaber, the editor of this film. And the direction by Goldhaber, which we've talked about a little bit here as well. Like, all of it comes together really cohesively. And as a result, yes, it's a really entertaining, engaging heist movie, but done in a Soderbergh-esque way in terms of its kind of indie spirit, but also channeling the tone of a Safdie's brothers film. Like it's kind of all of that meshed together, and it's really good. It's certainly a film that I highly recommend, and I believe it is available to at least rent on Amazon. I'm not sure if it's actually streaming anywhere.
I don't think it is. I believe you can rent on Amazon and iTunes at this point now. I'm not sure where else, though.
Yeah, so definitely check it out when it does become available. I'm sure eventually it'll find its way to a Netflix, or
I could see this falling on Hulu or Netflix or any one of those.
Yeah, I believe Neon is distributing this, so whatever they end up choosing, I'm sure you'll be able to find it.
I feel like a lot of Neon properties end up on Hulu at some point. I would not be surprised if that ends up being the case here.
At any rate, definitely encourage people to go and check it out. It is, at this point, it's still early, but up there is one of my favorite films I've seen so far this year.
Okay.
Really did like it.
It's a good movie.
All right, Brendan, any final thoughts on anything before we get out of here? Well,
I'm just glad we didn't blow up. We're just glad we didn't blow up the podcast. We didn't blow it up.
Yet.
Well, we have some upcoming content where something might blow up. So, I know that we've teased this already, but our next main show where we do our next power ranking of Disney movies, the Disney Renaissance era coming up here, I wonder if things will blow up there. That's
it's interesting because, we've had conversations about this offline. There will certainly be a few films that I think there'll at least be a consensus on. Now, where it all falls within the ranking, that could perhaps spark a little debate. I'm curious, though, if on the whole, there's more agreement than debate than what we had the first time around with the gold and silver ages. I do think there'll be some arguing as far as like, okay, what are we ranking, like, let's say like 1 through 4.
Yeah, because I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but yeah, there will definitely be some hairs being pulled when we get to those conversations, I think.
Yeah, I think that's certainly fair.
So maybe the podcast will blow up then.
But I'll just say this. Unless there's something that I just truly do not foresee coming, I don't think we're going to have like a Pinocchio Sleeping Beauty level of disparity.
Yeah.
Or am I wrong?
I don't know. I don't know. I can't speak for myself. I honestly just don't know. Because I'm trying to recall your thoughts on some of these films. I'm trying to recall Jay and Ryan's thoughts on some of these films, and I guess I'm trying to forecast instantly if there are any potentials that could lead to that kind of conversation.
Yeah.
I just don't know. Most likely it won't. I feel like given those of us who grew up watching the Renaissance era first, at least I think most of us did, given our respective ages, that was kind of what we grew up with because it was current at the time. We tend to have a close-knit relationships with a lot of the same ones. So we'll see.
Yeah,
we'll see. I think that's a nice tease to say you have to listen to this episode.
Yeah, so that's episode 536. Be on the lookout for that. We'll have a review of Master Gardener coming soon. And I'll just say this, speaking of things that might blow up, it does seem to appear that myself and also Mr. Jay Ledbetter are very much against the grain when it comes to the overall consensus on that film. So there might be some explosions when we get to that review. So.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah, at least the podcast won't explode. The comment feed will be the one thing that explodes then.
Yeah, exactly. So at any rate, stay tuned with all of that. Thanks, Brendan, for being here. Thanks for listening. Yeah. Everybody, let us know if you agree or disagree with any of our takes here, and we'll see you next time on the InSession Film Podcast.
Boom.
What a good movie. I like
movies. They're good.
Run the Army's race in person at the Pentagon. Army 10-miler general registration is now open. Go to Army10miler.com to register today. General registration presented by General Dynamics. Register today at Army10miler.com.